Glad you're here tonight. Walking away from religion can be lonely. You focus inward. You examine your deepest thoughts and desires and motives, and that can be solitary work. But there are other times when that loneliness can be depressing. When you wonder if you're the only one with doubts and if you're the oddball, the aberration, the heretic. And tonight is confirmation for me that many of you walk where I walk. And so I appreciate your presence. I was thinking the other day about how many sermons, talks, and speeches I've given over the course of my life extolling religion. Conservatively, I figure that I've given 60 every year for about 25 years. That's about 1,500 talks. And on average, it takes me about 8 hours to prepare and write and give those talks, which adds up to about 12,000 hours. At 40 hours a week, I've spent at least 6 years of my life thinking and writing and talking about religion. Tonight, as I speak for the first time on the virtues of becoming non-religious, I can't help but be a little embarrassed and a little shocked that you all came to hear me. You know, tonight's title could have been The Risks of Listening to Jim. The truth is, I still know a whole lot more about the religious life than the non-religious one. And if you've been non-religious all your life, what I share tonight as revolutionary may seem fairly elementary. What I offer tonight is not expertise, but a keen awareness of the risks involved in walking away from your religion and the rewards that you can experience. But before I get into all of that, let me offer 5 important clarifications. Clarification number 1. I was a Christian. What I talk about this evening, when I talk about leaving religion, I'm talking about leaving Christianity. While I suspect there are similar risks and rewards in leaving any religion, my experience is limited by my Christian context. So if you're not Christian, I apologize in advance for what doesn't resonate. Hopefully our panelists can fill in the gaps. Clarification number 2. I was a happy Christian. This talk is probably not for everyone, and it wouldn't have been for me 10 years ago. If you're happy with your religious life tonight, you may be in the wrong place. For much of my life, my religion satisfied. I lived out my beliefs with integrity and authenticity. I was happy. And though I've left, I don't look back with regret or guilt. If religion is working for you tonight, I'm glad. But I do worry about how painful this evening could be. Clarification number 3. I am no longer a Christian. Now, tonight is the first time I've ever said those words in a public forum, so you'll forgive me if I'm a little nervous. This is all new, exciting and frightening. In the past couple of years, I've discovered that there are similarities between finally admitting you're non-religious and finally admitting you're gay or lesbian. Tonight is coming out of the closet. Clarification number 4. Religion no longer works for me. I'm not going to spend much time tonight explaining why. I don't need to justify my decision or convince others to make it. When people ask me why I've become non-religious, I've learned that the kindest, most honest reply is simply, for a variety of reasons, religion doesn't work for me anymore. And if they insist on further explanation, I add, religion doesn't make me happy, and I've decided to look for happiness elsewhere. It's hard to argue with happiness. Clarification number 5. This decision was a long time coming. Tonight will not offer 5 easy steps for becoming non-religious. There is nothing easy about it. When you're raised in a religious culture, it's all you know. If it was a healthy community, it deeply satisfied. Walking away is painful. I went through all the stages of grief, denial, negotiation, anger, depression, before finally accepting my disbelief. For most people, leaving is a journey of 1,000 steps. And many of those steps away from religion happen before you're even aware of your dissatisfaction. Long before you finally walk away, your religious life begins to break down, to smoke and sputter, to lose momentum, until one day something inside you shifts. I remember that shift, that moment my religious life came grinding to a halt. It happened in the most ordinary of places. I was attending a summer cookout and eating a hot dog and shooting the breeze with some neighbors when one of them asked, "Are you a Quaker?" When I replied that I was, they asked, "Well, what do Quakers believe?" Now, that wasn't a hard question. I'd answered it 100 times. I could quickly and easily explain the Quaker testimonies, that all Quakers valued simplicity and peace and integrity and community and equality, that we sought to live out these testimonies in response to God's love for us, to live as faithfully as possible to the light within. As religious expressions go, that's not bad. But on that summer night, something shifted. Instead, I replied, Quakers are committed to the 5 testimonies: simplicity, peace, integrity, community, and equality. They seek to live out these testimonies in response to God's love, to live faithfully as possible to the light within. If you didn't catch the difference, I'm not surprised. Though I immediately sensed something was wrong, it wasn't until later that I realized what had changed. 2 words. On that summer night, for the first time in my religious life, instead of saying we and us, I said they and them. The end of faith sneaks up on you. One moment you're a Christian, and the next you're not. Though outwardly everything appears the same, you know something central to how you understand yourself has changed, and you can't go back, even if you wanted to. And you begin to walk away. You discover that leaving a religion is like walking away from a mountain. At that cookout 6 years ago, when I crossed that line between we and they, I took the first step away from my religion. But religions, like mountains, are massive landscapes, and no one escapes their shadow quickly. It was several months before I resigned as a pastor, nearly 2 years before I stopped attending worship services, and 4 years before I finally recognized I wasn't Christian anymore. It takes a long time to walk away from a mountain. And in the beginning, it fills the sky behind you. As you walk away, you're constantly aware of its presence over your shoulder. You measure your progress against it. You position yourself in relationship to it. When life gets tough, you may even turn back toward it. But for most people, once you walk away from the mountain, every day it slips lower into the horizon until one day its highest peaks disappear. And you find yourself in uncharted territory, wonderfully lost, but with no choice but to explore the lush world around you. That's where I stand tonight. I'm nervous, but mostly delighted. Having left the comfortable confines of church, I'm packing a tent. I've traded my map with the path between cradle and grave drawn in indelible ink for a compass. I'm heading cross country, no longer traveling the straight and narrow or carefully following the footsteps of the saints of old. I'm free to go anywhere. Tonight, I find that possibility terribly exciting. But I understand that what now excites me wasn't always as thrilling. Sometimes I was afraid. Other times I was sad. During the past 6 years, as I've walked away from the mountain, there have been risks, moments when I faced choices with unknown ramifications. Tonight, before we talk about the rewards of becoming non-religious, we need to honestly acknowledge the risks. In my experience, there are at least three kinds of risks when you walk away from your religion. First, there's the risk of ignoring your religion's warnings. And then there's the risk of losing people that you love. And finally, there's the risk of never really becoming non-religious. I want to talk about each of these in turn. One of the earliest risks of leaving your religion is the risk of ignoring its warnings about the consequences of that decision. When I was a child, I was taught a grim list of the penalties for those who left the church. They risked misery, hopelessness, and debauchery, the end of God's favor, blessing, and protection, being lost and alone, and being cast into the fires of hell. As a child, these possibilities were terrifying. As a religious adult, while I took them less literally, I still took them seriously. What if the warnings prove true? Today, when people ask, what if Christianity is right and you end up in hell? I try not to be smug. There was a time when I feared such things, when part of the reason I was religious was to escape punishment. It took many years and penning 2 books to completely shake that belief in hell. And even then, I was reluctant to let go of my assumption that the religious life was the best life. Leaving your religion seemed risky. Once I walked away from religion, I quickly discovered it wasn't. That religious people don't know much about the country beyond the mountain. Life was not miserable and hopeless. The non-religious were not wild hedonists bent on immoral living. You didn't suddenly experience a poor quality of life without God's blessing and protection. And as for the fires of hell, who could say? But it seemed a tale designed to keep people in the fold. Most of my religion's warnings turned out to be dubious. Only 2 of them proved it all true, and the first was inaccurate. I'd been warned that once I left the church, I would be lost. And on that, they were right. When I wandered away from the mountain, I did feel lost. All the familiar landmarks were gone. And it took me a while to figure out that what religious people describe as being lost was ironically not so much a consequence, but an opportunity. It was exactly what I sought. I was tired of inadequate answers to tough questions. I was tired of beliefs that didn't match my experience, of practices that no longer inspired. I was looking for the unfamiliar, for new opinions, thoughts, and encounters. I was ready to explore. I hadn't lost my faith. I simply had faith in different things, including myself. I hadn't lost my way. I'd simply chosen a different path. I hadn't lost my appreciation of the mysterious. I had simply surrendered the need to package such moments. Looking back, it was when I was most dissatisfied with my religion that I was truly lost. Toward the end of my religious life, I'd lost my passion, my courage, my integrity, my self-esteem. Surrounded by the familiar and certain, I'd begun to feel like a stranger and a fraud. I didn't lose myself in leaving. I found myself. What I lost, what I really risked, was not the loss of certain beliefs, but the loss of the community gathered around those beliefs. The only warning of my religion that proved completely true was how lonely it can feel when you first leave. Leaving your religion usually involves the loss of people you love. For many of us, our deepest relationships began within a religious community. My parents, siblings, and closest friends shared that community. For some, children and spouse are deeply committed to the religion. Most of these people continue to be happy and satisfied with their religious life, and many of them will never understand your decision. When you leave, no one throws you a going-away party. I've had some family and friends disconnect and distance themselves. A few have begged me to return. Others have expressed deep disappointment in my decision. In leaving your religion, you legitimately risk much of the support that you've depended upon for all your life. Until I left, I didn't realize how many of my needs the church met. The church was the social, emotional, and psychological Walmart of my life. All my needs were met under one roof. When you walk away from that, there's real loss. I suspect that many who stay in religion remain in religious traditions, not because they share the beliefs of that tradition, but because they still treasure the relationships. And giving lip service to ancient creeds that few understand in order to maintain membership in a community may be a shrewd trade. Since I made that trade for several years, I won't be too critical of it. The problem was that this compromise left me increasingly unhappy. I had to pretend to hold beliefs that I found unbelievable, to participate in practices that had become meaningless, to listen to sermons and prayers, some that I was preaching, that I found incredible, and to be ashamed of my identity as a Christian. For many, remaining in a religious community is a constant battle between your need for authenticity and your need for intimacy. In the end, I had to trust my family and friends, that those who loved me best would want me to be happy. They would either come to accept my new identity or figure out other ways to remain connected. And in most cases, that happened. But I won't pretend my experience is universal. For some, leaving your religion means risking every important relationship you have. And in such cases, I deeply respect those willing to still walk away. Unfortunately, walking the way is not the end of danger. The most dangerous risk in leaving religion is in never becoming non-religious. And this manifests itself in two temptations. The first temptation is to become anti-religious. Sometimes, instead of turning your back and walking away, you leave the mountain and you find a higher place to build fortifications. You choose to debate instead of reflect, to defend instead of explain, and to fight instead of explore. And this is so tempting. When you first leave, you're often insecure, and a good fight feels better than fleeing aimlessly. Unfortunately, when you define your life as a battle instead of a journey, your goal becomes philosophical victory instead of personal awareness. You elect to define yourself by what you disbelieve rather than by what you dream. And in so doing, you risk forever facing the mountain with your back to the very country that you wanted to explore. The second temptation is to settle in the first familiar place. Many people leave their religions and immediately seek another community with similar characteristics. I sought this for a while. I looked around for something that was exactly like the church, but wasn't the church. Frightened by the unknown, I looked for another sanctuary. This need for sanctuary exposed a deeply ingrained religious assumption that there is no goodness or happiness beyond the mountain. But I realized if I was unable to abandon that assumption, I would simply flee from sanctuary to sanctuary. In walking away from religion, you're deciding that there's goodness and happiness to be found almost anywhere. There's no longer the need for the holy and the secular, and this may be the heart of becoming non-religious. You willingly leave the peaceful meadow to explore over the next ridge. You seek the meaningful but in a variety of places and with a variety of people. A stroll through the forest may remind you of a moment in the temple or cathedral or mosque. But you understand that people were strolling in forests long before anyone built a temple, cathedral, or mosque. In these two temptations, the temptation to fight or to settle too quickly, those who leave religion risk never really becoming non-religious. Fortunately, the farther I've journeyed from the mountain, the less I've wanted to fight or to settle. Though it's taken 6 years to reach this point, leaving the mountain doesn't seem risky anymore. There's too much to see, too much to explore. There's so much that I would like to say about the rewards of the non-religious life, but the time constraints tonight require me to limit it to 3 things: free time, personal autonomy, and a broader view of the world. My first reward in leaving religion was the gift of time. Until I left, I'd had no idea how much time I had spent in religious endeavors. When I figured it out, I spent at least 10 or 15 hours a week sustaining my religious life. Leaving felt like going on vacation. I fell in love with weekends, this fantastic human invention where people take 2 entire days to reflect and rest. And the first few Sunday mornings were incredible. I turned off the alarm. I woke slowly next to my wife. I went to get the paper and coffee. I welcomed our young daughter into our bed. We talked and laughed together. Eventually, I poured our daughter a bowl of cereal and set her up in the living room in front of the TV with cartoons. I returned to our bedroom, I locked the door, and I made love to my wife. That never happened at church. Every time we tried, we got in trouble. If the religious knew what the non-religious were doing while they were in worship, churches and temples and mosques would probably empty. Religion is good at filling time. As a former pastor, I spent most of my life inventing events and activities and obligations for religious people. I gave the impression that the best Christians were those who spent the most time away from home and family and busy doing the work of the church. If I have any regrets, it is in creating the impression that idle hands were the devil's workshop, because they are not. Though the non-religious can certainly fill up their lives with business as easily as the religious, so much of the religious life was about obligation. I did many things not because they brought me joy, but because I thought I had to meet some expectation of God or of my religion. The religious life often felt frantic. And though I'd been promised eternity, there was never enough hours in the day to do all that was expected. For me, one of the richest rewards of the non-religious life was the freedom to order my life based on what brought me happiness, to do what worked, and to stop doing what didn't. The choice was mine. I soon discovered this freedom was possible in every aspect of my life. I was no longer a servant of God, beholden to God for my marching orders. I was no longer a child of God, forever dependent upon a heavenly parent. While that may have felt comforting at times, children and servants aren't expected to make decisions. They're told what to do, and their worth is measured by their obedience. When I became a non-religious person, I accepted my identity as a free moral agent. My life belonged to me. I could act and think and feel and engage in ways that I chose. I could read Bertrand Russell and Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris in public. I could stop nodding my head when people made existential claims I found absurd. I could quit feeling guilty for doing things I didn't find objectionable. I could think and say things without fearing censor. I could interact freely with people I'd once seen as odd or even dangerous. In a single word, one of the greatest rewards of the non-religious life is freedom. I'm as free tonight as I've ever been. And though I may not choose to do everything, I can do anything. And this is heady stuff. And sometimes those of us who leave religions don't handle this well. Some wander down dangerous paths that they later regret. Non-religious folk don't always make the right choices, but it's our choice. And when we do what we don't do it out of obligation. You know, I always thought of myself as a thinker when I was religious, but I've discovered that I was more of a believer. Though the words believe and think are used interchangeably, they are not the same. To believe is to trust, to have faith in, to accept as true. And religions value and create believers. This is not to suggest that religious people don't think. The problem is that believing has become the predominant verb for religion. It so governs that in some religious circles, thinking is discouraged and intellectual inquiry mocked. When the religious do think, they're often discouraged from thinking about a whole range of questions and topics. Some thoughts are blasphemous. But free thinkers ignore such things. They get to consider all they encounter, ponder the possibilities, reflect on their prejudices, theorize about what might be, and experiment. The words they utter carry no universal authority or divine inspiration. They must be judged on their merits, trusted only if they resonate. And when thoughts prove inadequate, they can choose to think differently. Changing your opinion is not nearly as ominous as changing your beliefs. This newfound freedom includes the freedom of association. When I was religious, there were people I chose not to associate with because they thought differently than I. If I did talk with them, it was often with the agenda of altering their beliefs. And I was taught to pity those who did not share my religious conviction. One of the rewards of becoming non-religious has been the freedom to engage people without an agenda, to listen attentively to their story. And that brings me to my final reward to focus on tonight. Becoming non-religious has broadened my view of the world. Oddly, when I lived on the mountain, I saw the rest of the world as flat and featureless. And it was only when I walked down into the world did I discover its diverse contours. I was able to hear new stories and opinions. I was able to abandon my need for certainty and live in ambiguity. One of the hardest religious assumptions to abandon is that there is only one way, one answer, one opinion, and one story. Until I left, I hadn't understood the oppressive power of a single narrative to diminish your ability to live in the world. For example, I considered myself a well-read and informed person, someone who thoroughly understood the history of religion in the United States. So you can imagine my surprise when after leaving religion I stumbled on the writings of Robert Ingersoll. How many of you know of Ingersoll? A few. Robert Ingersoll was one of the most famous orators of the late 1800s, capable of filling the largest auditoriums with people willing to pay $1, an outrageous cost in that day, to hear him speak for as much as 3 hours. And what did Ingersoll speak on? Atheism. Let me read you one of my favorite Ingersoll quotes. While I am opposed to all orthodox creeds, I have a creed myself. And my creed is this: happiness is the only good. The time to be happy is now. The place to be happy is here. The way to be happy is to make others so. This creed is somewhat short, but it's long enough for this life and strong enough for this world. And if there is another world, when we get there, we can make another creed. But this creed certainly will do for now. How was it possible that I, a well-read religious intellectual, had gone my entire life without reading one word by the most famous American religious critic of the 19th century. Simply said, religions generate and protect a single story, one that leaves out any counter story. And that single story, once created, has the ability to control how we understand our world. In the story I was given, Robert Ingersoll, one of the most prominent orators of the 19th century, never existed. I can understand the world so much better when I hear multiple stories, even if I may not choose to adopt all that they say. By abandoning the primary story of my life, the Christian one, I'm able to listen more openly to stories I previously discounted, to incorporate some of their story into mine. You know, I've been fascinated by the TED Talks and TEDx speeches. The first time I heard one, I immediately knew what I was hearing. And it was something I had missed in leaving religion. TED Talk sounded like a good sermon. And this format invited different perspectives to share the same stage. And in the hearing of multiple stories, it offered the opportunity to see a broader view of the world. When people ask me what will replace religion for the non-religious, I reply that it won't be any single thing. But I suspect TED Talks and the like are part of whatever is coming. You see, one of the values embedded in a non-religious culture is a commitment to embrace uncertainty. As I look back, much of my religious life was focused on supplying answers. I was taught a list of certainties about God and the world and encouraged to offer those answers asked or unasked. When faced with difficult questions about human suffering and destiny and meaning, the religious response was seldom, "I don't know." In the past couple of years, I've learned that "I don't know" is not an admission of defeat or the beginning of despair. As an explorer in the world, acknowledging what I don't know is a good starting place. I'm free to look elsewhere for explanations, expecting that if I am courageous and curious, some mysteries will be solved. Others will be less mysterious, and still others will remain forever unknown. I just don't know which mysteries will be which. And this is the beauty of the non-religious life for me. It values rather than fears the ambiguous, uncertain, unknown. It's more fluid, willing to utilize a variety of words and stories to describe a single experience. It's more personal, allowing each of us to offer our unique perspectives on what we see, hear, and feel. I'm learning to tell people what I think instead of what I believe, and to admit what I do not know. Which brings me to my final word. I've learned quickly that whenever I talk about becoming non-religious, the first question I'm invariably asked is, do you still believe in God? Over the past 6 years, I've tried on many responses to that question. At first, when living in the shadow of the mountain, I replied quickly, of course. But gradually, I realized that it was a half-truth. In most circumstances, I didn't believe in the God of my questioner. And over time, I learned to respond by asking, tell me about the God you believe in, and I'll tell you whether I believe in that God. That usually ends the conversation. But I won't let it tonight. Does God exist? After spending nearly 50 years of my life studying God, seeking some kind of relationship, and defending God's existence, I don't know. But if you want my opinion, I think in moments like tonight, when I allow myself to be honest and authentic, and when I share time and space with other people trying to do the same, I often experience a mysterious connection with myself and with them. And I feel that connection tonight. I used to call it God. Now, I just call it happiness. Thank you for listening so long and so well.
What we're going to do, I want each of the panelists to identify themselves and then briefly tell the story of their journey from religion to non-religion. And then we'll probably have some time for some other questions to the panel. If you think of questions, as Jim said, write it on the card, turn it in before you go on break, and we'll answer as many of those as we can after the break. Okay, Sean, would you like to start? Just identify yourself and then tell us
Sure.
your story.
My name is Sean O'Brien, and I started out in Southern California, which is where I was born. My first introduction to religion was learning the catechism because my father's side of the family was very staunchly Irish Catholic. My mother's side of the family was Southern Baptist. So the first and only family get-together, the in-laws got together, didn't go very well. But we were Catholic until my mom and dad split up, which is when my brother and I were 3. I have a twin brother, by the way, in Riverside, California. And after that, we went back to the Baptist church and stayed there until we moved out of the area and moved next door to a couple, a Native American couple. But they were Seventh-day Adventists, and they were very friendly, very nice people. And we started going to their church and learned a few things that were different from both the way the Baptists and the Catholics believed. So we were Seventh-day Adventists for a number of years until my brother at the age of 10 developed a crush on this girl at school whose dad happened to be the pastor of a local Baptist church. So at my brother's behest, we started going to the Baptist church. And this was a different form of Baptist church than my mother and grandmother's church. They had a different belief. It was much more the fire and brimstone, kind of energy going on there. And so we stayed and went to that church for a number of years until we started high school. And at that point, the high school that we were going to, the local public school high school, it had some issues, and my mom worked very, very hard and got us into a private Christian school that was run by the local Assemblies of God. So you go from Baptist to Pentecostal, got filled with the Holy Spirit, spoke in tongues. I still speak in tongues, if I want to. And it was during that point that I felt what I thought was a call of God to study religion and probably or possibly go into the ministry or at least do something like church management, that sort of thing, So I got interested in theology. I wanted to defend my faith, so I started learning apologetics. And in order to do that well, I wanted to also learn about different kinds of theology, different kinds of thought, and started looking at comparative religion as well as the history of the Christian church and studying mainline Bible introductions, Bible, what you would learn if you went to a mainline seminary. And it was very eye-opening because in studying comparative theology, you learn that the Catholics have one way of looking at it, which is dogmatic theology. Protestants have different words for it. It's mainly systematic theology. And they're different things, you know, and when you study the history of Christianity, you find out that there's very little in what people think of as their faith and how they think people have always believed. There's very little that actually is the same from one sect to another, especially down through time. And so that was eye-opening, but I ended up not sticking with studying theology or going into that as a career. Instead, I chose to become a computer software developer and IT specialist. It's a little bit more stable and pays a bit better than a pastorship. But my first job was for Campus Crusade for Christ. I worked there in the literature distribution arm of Campus Crusade, a company called Here's Life Publishers, for 5 years. I started out as a computer operator and programmer. I ended up as a manager. And during that time, I read still extensively, you know, from what they were putting out, from guys like Josh McDowell, everything that he wrote. But by the end of that time period, I was looking at it much more critically than what I would have and what I did start out to begin with. And then I had a job offer to do a consulting job here in Indianapolis, and that was 1986. So I came back here and sort of, my life changed. I eventually met my wife and we married. But by the time I left Campus Crusade, that organization, the skepticism had gotten to the point where I realized there was no one truth, that you could point to any point in history and any sect and see a whole range of different beliefs, and everyone thought they were the same, you know, or at least they were the ones that held the truth. I'll put it that, I meant to put it that way. So coming out here, in a way, I soft landed out of religion. But the one moment of truth was when I told my mom, I don't believe in God. And she was shocked, because I really was, in our family, I was the one who became the spiritual leader, the one that was always gung-ho about God and sticking with it, and if things were bad, you hold on to your faith. And she thought about it for a minute and said, you know, that's surprising. In effect, what she said is, you know, that's surprising, but you're a good person. You've always been a good person, and that's not going to change. So.
One thing I might say about Sean is that Sean and his wife Diana, who's sitting down here near the front, I started the humanist group in Indiana in 1999, and they both came on board pretty shortly after we started the group. And Sean has run a monthly scientific examination of religion discussion during most of that time, and he still does once a month. So if you're interested, we'd love to have you come over and join in with us.
Yeah, it's a great outlet for my hobby.
Okay, Fred, would you like to go next here?
Hello, everyone. My name is Fred Mandelkorn, and I guess the logical way for me to give this talk would be what Sean did, start at the beginning and conclude at the present day. But I'm going to do things a little different. I'm going to first give a broad overview of my wanderings in the religious world. And then I'm going to describe where I am today, and then I'll give some key turning points. Let me say that in general, the journey is kind of a zigzag path, into religion, out of religion, into religion, out of religion. And here, when I say religion, I'm referring to Judaism. So that's the general nature of the journey. And in preparing this talk, I asked myself, what can I say about this zigzagginess? Why did I do it? What caused these zigzags? And after giving it a lot of thought, I think I can summarize it this way. The zigs towards religion were really zigs toward things like community, friendship, sentimentality, ethnic and cultural identity, things of that sort, all related to Judaism. The zags away from religion were really zags away from supernaturalism. You know, the idea that the world contains gods and demons and devils and this sort of thing. The zags away from religion were really zags away from that. So that's the general plan here. Where do I stand today? Where I stand today is, if I may use an expression that Jennifer Michael Hecht used, she called herself a Jewish atheist, okay? Incidentally, Jennifer Michael Hecht wrote a book called Doubt, A History of Skepticism. And she visited Indianapolis a few years ago, gave a talk at the Center for Inquiry, at Butler University, and at Congregation Beth El Zedek. And I think what she means, and I think what I mean when I say Jewish atheist, is someone who identifies culturally and ethnically with Jews. But someone who also does not identify with the supernatural God, the supernatural creator of the universe, that sort of thing. Now, several friends of mine, both Jewish and non-Jewish, have asked me, this sounds like a contradiction in terms. Judaism is a religion. How can you be Jewish and not believe in God? And that's a very, very good question. It comes to the heart of where I am right now. And I don't know if I have a good answer for that. But the closest thing I have in the way of answer is the way an Italian-American might call himself Italian, even though he's never been to Italy and doesn't speak any Italian. But his parents maybe were born in Italy. He likes Italian cooking. He likes Italian singing, this sort of thing. And so he calls himself Italian. Is he really Italian? I don't know. In some ways he is, in some ways he's not. Is a Jewish atheist really Jewish? Well, I leave it up to you. I think he is. I like Jewish culture. I like Jewish comedians. I like Jewish cooking. I'm not ashamed to call myself Jewish. I'm proud of it. And in that sense, I'm a little distinct from what Jim said in his third observation. He said, I am no longer Christian. I don't say I am no longer Jewish. I am Jewish, but I don't believe in the supernatural. Now for maybe one or two highlights before my friend Nathan holds up the red sign. He already gave me the yellow sign. I think he just held up the red sign. Okay, I can't give you any highlights of this zigging in and out of religion. Maybe later on when we have a question and answer period, I'll be able to do that. Thank you very much.
Yeah, just a little about Fred. Fred found Center for Inquiry about the time we opened our place on the Canal Walk, which was in 2007. And he probably attends more of the programs there than most anybody except me. So he's gotten really involved since he found us, and we're glad that Fred found us and we found him. Okay, Elishba?
Hi, my name is Elishba, and I am Pakistani student. I go to Earlham College in Richmond, Indiana. My story is very different personally on a very family level, different than a lot of people who do leave the Islamic religion for various reasons, and I'll try to break them down. I have faced oppression, religious oppression, because I grew up in Pakistan, and Pakistan is not a secular country. It has a state religion, and it's called Islam. And the country's laws are based on Islamic laws, and in Islam, you don't have an option to leave the religion. And the consequence is not just losing family, friends, community, it's also losing your life. So in Pakistan, yes, there are blasphemy laws, and you have capital punishment for that. You also have capital punishment for sex outside wedlock and homosexuality and all of these things, and they're all based on hardcore Sharia laws. So in that sense, there was a lot of religious oppression. But I was personally born into a very, very liberal sect of Islam. It's a very small community, but it's very prominent all over the world. No, I was not forced to wear a hijab. I was not forced to wear a niqab. I never wore any of those things. In fact, it was discouraged in the community to be wearing those things. And feminism and equality and all of these things are actually encouraged. So I never had any problems going to school. I went to a Catholic school for 11 years in Pakistan. So that was interesting too, because, my mom is like a little religious, so I would just wear a cross to, just like to piss her off sometimes. I would do that. And she'd be like, what are you doing? You're Jewish. And I'm just like, Mom. So that was like the fun parts, fun memories that I have quarreling with my mom. My dad is a secularist. I have always been a secularist. I cannot imagine, cannot recall any point in my life where I defended religious laws for anything. I was very spiritualistic, mystical, because my sect also included Hindu traditions and a lot of different traditions. There was music, and there was singing, and there was dancing, and those were like very nice forms of community gathering. So I got introduced to a very beautiful poetry and 3 different languages through that religion. In total, I speak 7 languages. So those 3 of the languages were introduced to me because of the religion. So that sect gave me a lot of good friendships and community, and all of those things were there. But reason wasn't there. So I did not have any reason to justify the authority of the leader of the sect. I did not have any reason to, I was always very anti-authoritarian, so I was very, I wouldn't even listen. It was not just teenage angst, I assure you, it still continues. So I was just like, if you're gonna tell me, I'm not gonna do it, but if you're gonna request me, I might. So those were the things. I was just like, I was just trying to imitate God, but those things were happening, and it was just a matter of time when I told my dad, I was like, Dad, I don't think I believe in a God. He's like, oh, I never did either. And it was so casual, and I'm like, why didn't you tell me? And he's like, these are the things, a person comes to their own conclusion. And he was giving me all these philosophical answers. I'm like, okay, that's all great, but why didn't you tell me? So it was always very fun conversation with my father. So that's how I'm just cutting it short a lot. So that was my upbringing. And then I went to Canada for my high school, and then I came to the United States. And it was not until I went to Ireland for my study abroad program that I actually truly realized that I really want to be a secular activist. And the biggest reason was that it was not just Islam. Although Islam is very, very hostile, and the kind of things that I've seen in Pakistan, like I cannot go back home right now because I get death threats all the time and all of those things. So although I'm an international student, I have to look for ways to avoid going home. And a lot of the people I love and care about are not, apart from my family, everybody is here too. So a bunch of reasons, but if I go home, I will either be thrown into jail or be killed by a violent mob, and I don't want either of those things. So, so those are the real consequences, like very political consequences of leaving this religion, and it's belonging to a country where religious freedom is, that idea is an alien idea. And then I came to the United States, and after my study abroad in Ireland, and that's when I started, because when I saw physical walls between Catholics and Protestants and then all of those things, and I was just like, okay, it's like a theme that I'm seeing throughout, not just history, but in current political world as well. And somebody needs to say something. That's why I started to speak, and I would defer with Jim on this, that you don't need to be anti-theistic. I think sometimes you need a strong voice like Hitchens every now and then to just give you that push that you need to look what you were avoiding before. And I'll take questions after.
Okay, I want to say a couple things about Elishaba. I met her for the first time 2 years ago at the Center for Inquiry headquarters conference for student leaders, because she started a Free Thought Society at Earlham College here in Indiana, and so she was there along with student leaders. And I think it happened that she contacted the leaders of the IU Bloomington student group, and they picked her up in Richmond and took her to Amherst, New York, which is where our headquarters is. So that's when I first met her, and she is getting very active in organizations to try to help support Muslims who are leaving their religion. So I think we'll see big things out of Elishaba. Okay, Susan?
Hi, my name is Susan Lancer. These lights are really bright, I can't see you. I grew up in Mississippi. Being a Mississippian, we tend to ramble, so I wrote this down for you. I'm 46. I'm married with 2 beautiful children. I grew up in small towns and small churches. Churches of Christ, specifically Southern Churches of Christ, are New Testament-focused churches. They reject the idea of denominational classification because they believe they are the one true church of Christ. There is non-instrumental music, a cappella singing, simple buildings, no adornment, no icons. Women are expected to be submissive to their husbands and are not allowed to speak in assembly or hold positions of authority in the church. I mention that because it's kind of always been a problem for me. Baptism by full immersion for the remission of sins. You might know those Duck Dynasty guys. What you don't know about them, they're Church of Christ. They think you're all going to hell. So. I joined the church early. I intended and worked to be the best Christian I could possibly be. I prayed frequently, read the Bible, asked God constantly to forgive me of my sinful thoughts and behaviors. I shared my faith as often as I could. There, simple. Then I became a teenager in the 1980s. As a teen, I read a ton of science fiction. If nothing else, Isaac Asimov and Ursula Le Guin alone will challenge a small, insulated worldview. Typical teenage rebellion became a virtual pressure cooker. The duality of balancing church doctrine and wanting to explore my modern thinking world eventually took a huge toll. My questioning was met with disapproval. My searching led to internal turmoil, but no answers, only more guilt. My self-esteem plummeted. I left home at the age of 18. I worked hard and I partied hard. I practiced a lot of risky behavior because I no longer cared for myself spiritually. That was the price I paid in leaving a rigid system and having no internal compass that I knew of or that I trusted in. I eventually ran off to Florida with a guy, got pregnant, got married because that's what you do. Found the local Church of Christ and intended to raise my child in the church. Then my marriage, later on, that had been hastily spliced together on shaky ground, fell apart. Divorce, the big D. Now, Church of Christ doctrine gives divorce a big thumbs down. I wasn't asking permission. I was just surviving a turbulent, difficult situation. My choice to divorce changed my relationship with my mother, my family, a lot of those small churches, most of all. My mother, the relationship changing was the biggest loss to me. Now, single motherhood, alone, estranged from my family. My church did not excommunicate me, surprisingly. So I threw myself into work in church as best I could. I eventually married again, someone from church. I was sure I could prove to everyone and to my mother that I could be a good Christian as a remarried person and show her that everything was going to be okay. I moved to Nashville, Tennessee with my husband. I secured a job with the Gospel Advocate Company, a prolific Church of Christ publishing house. I read a lot of sermons as I was proofreading them there. There was a lot of doctrinal navel-gazing and circular conversations, kind of eye-opening, seeing so much from an insider point of view. Again, women don't preach in the Church of Christ. So I really never looked at it from that point of view. My then husband graduated from ministry school. I had already begun to have serious doubts about this new life I had cobbled together for myself. I had seriously begun to question the rigid church doctrine that I had surrounded myself with. We went on an interview with a small church in Illinois, interviewing for the position of minister and wife. I had what I could only call a coming out moment sitting in that little church. Almost an out-of-body kind of feeling. The realization hit me hard at that moment that this wasn't where I belonged. This small-town church wasn't for me. This rigid structure was once again suffocating me. As I pulled away, my relationship crumbled. My husband became kind of an Old Testament kind of keeper. Eventually, I ended up in an emergency room as a result of his attempt to make me into the wife he intended me to be. As my would-be idyllic Christian lifestyle and marriage crumbled around me, and I failed once again. I did what I do, ran, survived, worked, dropped out of church, swore and smoked cigars a lot, dated. Later on, I got serious with a handsome young police officer. We dated for a while. We got more serious. I wasn't ready to give up my spiritual quest. He indulged me, and we church shopped together. We tried several Christian denominations, never really found the one that fit. The Baptists wanted to rebaptize me. The Unitarians seemed too touchy-feely, and that creeped me out. Other evangelicals kept saving my child's soul during children's church while we were visiting, never stopping to ask for permission. We moved to Bloomington, Indiana, and got married. Bloomington was a culture shock for me. I met feminists, Buddhists, pagans, liberal Democrats. I read books on human anthropology, goddess culture, paganism. Now I was searching all religions for answers. I even took a What's Your Spiritual Type quiz on BeliefNet.com. If you haven't taken it, it's kind of an eye-opener. My faith had changed dramatically over the years. I realized that the need to be in constant prayer felt no longer necessary. I had been constantly apologizing for myself to a deity at nearly every moment for decades. It was a hard habit to break. Feeling alone in my own mind was a curious sensation. It was good, and it was also very confusing. I found myself breaking the habit of speaking to someone in my head constantly that was not me. We moved to Indianapolis. We had a baby. I threw myself into home, baby raising, and family. BeliefNet.com finally categorized me as a secular humanist. What's a secular humanist? Online research revealed that there was an actual secular humanist group right here in Indianapolis. Who are these people? Are they subversive? Might they be dangerous? I had been warned about these kind of people for my whole life, hadn't I? I had to check them out. They turned out to be a community of wonderful, warm, interesting, intelligent, real people. I attended regular playgroups there. I made friends. I found community there, a rich community of ideas, philosophy, people interested in learning and working together towards an ethical, peaceful society. That's humanism in a nutshell. No gods, no masters, just people, and reality in full focus, with no religious rose-colored glasses. Turns out I didn't need those rose-colored glasses after all. At some point, I realized I no longer need to live fearfully. I don't worry about my eternal soul. Funny thing, I'm no longer afraid of the dark either. The journey wasn't easy. It has been filled with difficulty, heartbreak, failure, and picking myself back up again. But I'm here. I'm moving toward a future that I no longer feel suffocated by or feel afraid of. I live my life the way I do, not because I might go to heaven or burn in hell. And I finally feel free. Thank you for listening.